Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Dan. I'm doing an astrology transit video for you today about the planet Mercury, which has just ingressed into Sagittarius and is forming an opposition to Pluto, as well as a sextile to Pluto and an opposition to Uranus. And if that wasn't enough, we're also going to be having a Mercury retrograde soon. So allow me to walk you through this. It's actually a fairly complex transit. But what's interesting, first of all, is that immediately today Mercury has ingressed into Sagittarius. Uranus is in Gemini, being a perfect opposition to it. And Mercury rules Gemini. So this means that there is an opposition with reception, meaning that not only are these two planets in a kind of a direct, the opposition is the strongest of the aspects, they're in a direct contact, and Uranus is in Mercury's home sign, while Mercury is in a place of debilitation in Sagittarius. Typically, what this means is um, if you consider the fact that Mercury is a communicator and Sagittarius is a sign ruled by Jupiter, which has to do with Jupiter being the largest planet in the zodiac, the growth and expansion and all this kind of stuff, and altruism and generosity. There's this kind of problem about, imagine if you had a very big, complicated thing to tell, to communicate, but you had limited time and you had to like funnel a very complicated thing into a very simple thing to communicate it to a large, not just a large audience, but to basically you have to like deliver, like a messenger has to deliver the message and then run on to the next thing and then run on to the next thing, and then perhaps you even with Mercury there's a need to like cover all your bases maybe, or to span a huge multiplicity of perhaps different topics or something like that. And there's a sense that you just don't have, there's too much information to be communicated in a small bite-sized format. But there's an attempt to, time is of the essence. You need to try to communicate the message anyways, but there's a problem. So there's this kind of problem that maybe something's lost in translation, or you don't have enough time to communicate the whole message. And there's the Pluto there is creating a bit of pressure. We're not gonna, the thing about this is that it's, if you notice, first of all, Sagittarius is a fire sign. Whenever there's an opposition, they're going to happen between these pairs of fire and air. And I've seen a number of other astrologers talking about how this could be a lucky transit based on the fact that the ruler of Sagittarius is currently exalted in Jupiter. There's some things to basically be careful about with this. First of all, the exaltation is different than, let's say, a domicile dignity, because a domicile dignity is a planet securely at home in its own home sign. The Cancer is the sign of the moon, okay? With Cancer, the sign of the moon, Jupiter exalts there in contrast to being in its fall in the opposite side. Hold on. The thing is, exaltation and fall basically has this seesaw kind of dynamic, right? Where to be, the meaning of being exalted means to be lifted up on high, but to the sense where you have a kind of awareness that there's a certain kind of inherent fragility, or you are lifted up on high, but there's always the risk or the the view of the downward fall, the precariousness of being lifted up on such a exalted position. And that if this what I'm reminded here of Mercury and Uranus opposition is perhaps sometimes Gemini, because they have the two faces and everything. You might think of the clowns the jesters, the jokers, or perhaps even the fool, right? And in tarot, what is the fool is perhaps confident, optimistic, positive, but perhaps not foolishly unaware of the fact that he is lifted up on high and about to tumble into a blind spot, basically, due to his ignorance, his lack of experience. And so part of the problem here is that when you look at, I would not advise you get too cocky with this one. First of all, because Jupiter is in a grand water trine, basically, meaning that it's aspecting. It was having a nice trine aspect to Mercury, and it's like it's almost as if Mercury was in a conversation with Jupiter where there's a lot of stuff happening, and now Mercury has stepped out of that position, and Mercury, there's a certain sense of liberation of being out of that heavy water dynamic, but now Mercury is tumbling directly into the foolish territory of the Uranus opposition, right? And Mercury is now out of the, it's like as if Mercury was just engaged in a conversation with Jupiter, and Mercury, going to go into Sagittarius. It's my sign. I'm going to give you this and that thing to do. And then once Mercury goes in there, now Mercury is out of contact with Jupiter, and now is in a new, now confronted by Uranus. And there's a kind of a, what if Mercury just forgets everything that Jupiter told it and goes unconscious? And not only that, but we have a Mercury retrograde coming up. And so what happens is not only is the Mercury retrograde coming up, but Mars is following shortly behind, right? So what's going to happen is that about a week from now, Mars will ingress into Sagittarius on November 4th, and then immediately or very shortly after that, there is going to be a stationing retrograde of Mercury in Sagittarius, and then Mercury will then have a retrograde run-in with Mars. And Mars, hold on, I'm hitting the wrong button. Retrograde run-in with Mars. There'll be a Mercury-Mars conjunction around the 5th, 6th degree of Sagittarius on the 13th of November. And at that point in time, Uranus will also retrograde back into Taurus. And if we keep playing this out, Mercury also retrogrades back into Scorpio and experiences a moment of retrograde Cazimi in an opposition to Uranus in Taurus. And so there's this kind of like, we're at this moment now where there's a certain kind of like, while there is a nice, well-dignified Jupiter in Cancer that makes everything going on in these transits a little bit better than it would be otherwise, I'll give you that. There's still this problem in that if we look at where we're at now, we're at the end of October, entering November, there's going to be a process playing out through the month of November where there might be a sense of relief in Mercury and Mars getting out of this grand water trine, which is basically very stormy. Let's put it that way. I mean, there was just a huge hurricane in the Caribbean. There's something tumultuous, I think, about the grand water trine. Even if trines are typically more easy than squares and oppositions and stuff like that, there's a sense of a relief, perhaps, from Mercury and Mars of escaping those stormy water emotional energies, and that, a fire sign, fire and air was yang. Might feel a bit more optimistic perhaps, but there's a sense of could be a foolish optimism that happens in the blind spot of Jupiter. And so we're going to have the first couple weeks of November, this dynamic playing out where there will then be a Mercury retrograde and a retrograde Mercury-Mars conjunction, and then the whole dynamic with Uranus and Mercury is going to repeat in different signs here in Scorpio. And so it's kind of like you thought you had gotten out, but then you're just getting sucked back into the grand water trine. And now the grand water trine has Uranus there creating a kite aspect. And then Venus, to make matters more interesting, Venus rules Taurus, and Venus is going to be, the ruler of Venus is going to be opposing Uranus with reception, right? So that you have an aspect where, so there's kind of a similar thing playing out the way that in Gemini, Mercury is opposing Uranus with reception. Now you've got you have Venus opposite Uranus with reception. And it's only at this point that we get Mercury stationing direct, um, leading us into the month of November. So there's quite a complicated dynamic playing out. The grand water trine is going to remain a constant throughout all of this, and that just now we have a little moment of perhaps a, you know, a kind of a silly yangy moment of relief. But the problem about this is, I would also risk about being too positive about this, because there's obviously, I think there could also be like the shocks of disruptions. For example, I just recently saw in the news, I'll give you one example, that Amazon just laid off a whole bunch of corporate employees, and that there could be in the same way that like Doge was like a bunch of, what would I say, chuckle fucks, being all like giggling and laughing about people losing their jobs. Or it's like this kind of thing where it's like, for some people it could be a very like scary, disturbing, disruptive, disabling, or whatever it is. It's like a bad time for a lot of people, but you could be like the clown who's like just giggling and chuckling and like making jokes. And I think that's kind of the energy what I see here, is that it's kind of like, you don't want to, I have this problem because there's something, there's like, I have a difficulty in, there's something about making stuff, like making astrology videos, which is like, it helps to keep me in a good mood because it's fun and I enjoy it. But then I don't, it's like, there's this kind of thing where I don't want to create a persona of being just like a silly person who doesn't take anything seriously. And if there's serious things happening in the world with current events like that, it makes me feel comfortable for me to be like, I'm going to enjoy what I'm doing with astrology and having a lot of fun with it, and then being frivolous and naive about, and then talking about serious things where there's actual real stakes on the line for people and it matters and all this kind of stuff. And but there's something about so I don't want to like do this with the wrong tone, but with Uranus, there's this kind of thing about like the liberating, disrupting, or like this idea of technology, innovation, efficiency, all this kind of stuff. And that this could be in a sense that you're like, cutting costs by laying people off. And it's also kind of can you imagine also getting laid off before like the holiday season, getting laid off before Christmas or something like that? It's kind of like cold-hearted. And so there's this kind of like, at the moment, maybe there's going to be, maybe you're going to make people angry, or maybe this disruption is going to piss people off, and then like you're going to think you're like, oh, we just solved the problem, we're going to balance the books, we're going to balance the budget. And then now your Mercury retrograde Mars, you've got a bunch of angry people who don't like your company, and your stocks are going down or something. I'm just suggesting perhaps, that could be part of the dynamic. I also saw in the news today reports of Trump taking, I don't know, Trump being evaluated for whether he's senile or demented, and being perhaps confusing that with an IQ test or something like that. And it's also important to consider that Donald Trump has the full moon on the Gemini Sagittarius axis. So this could be an omen for some foolish Trump behavior over the month of November. These are all things that are important to consider. And I don't mean to be, this is the whole thing, is that I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer by um, pointing out some of the possible problems, but I'm thinking that, like, part of the meaning of Uranus, of course, is the gift of foresight, right? To see what's coming in advance, to not be taken off guard by it, right? And the retrograde of Uranus back into Taurus is going to be interesting, because there suggests that some kind of unsettled business with whatever house that represents in your chart or whatever. I'm not going to go through the horoscopes with it. Um, there's some kind of unfinished business on the Taurus Scorpio axis that is going to be taken care of, or somehow loose ends are going to be tied up, because the ruler of Taurus, Venus, is going to be in that opposition with Uranus. And leading us into, we're going to have both Venus and Mars together in Sagittarius for a while, which will be interesting. And then a forward motion, another Mercury Uranus opposite. So we're gonna have a series of a whole bunch of Mercury Uranus oppositions that go along with Uranus retrograde. This is also particularly interesting to consider in the sense of all the stuff around AI, information technology, all of this, and going back into Taurus being more perhaps about resources, geopolitics. There's a lot of also, I mean, Uranus in Gemini is a fairly loaded one, because the America Revolution happened when Uranus was in Gemini, so everybody is sort of or like the Civil War happened when Uranus was in Gemini, so there's a lot of talk around that. There's also, with Uranus in Gemini, guess where Putin has his moon sign? Right at the very beginning of Gemini. So there's certain things, it's taking some of the pressure perhaps off of some of those places, but it's a tricky one, because there could be, you may see some disruptions around perhaps supply chains, or I think the main thing around Uranus is there's a question around whether innovation comes from simplifying things and streamlining things as a kind of reduction, or if innovation is more of like something like opening the door into a new unknown realm of complexity, where there could be all kinds of problems that you don't even know, because it's such a new territory. It's a process of discovery, right? Like, you don't, like, there's this kind of thing of like taking what you already have established and making that more simple, versus opening up the door to the unknown, the unexpected, and like the fool who's going to jump off the cliff doesn't know exactly what step he's going to take that's going to be the one that sends him tumbling down, right? You don't know what step like you don't, it's a completely, so there's this kind of, with the retrograde, there's a sense of perhaps consolidating or tying up loose ends and simplifying certain things, so that at least you're a bit more prepared for the process of, leaning into that discovery of, or leaning into the future, which may have all sorts of unseen complications, complexities, and unpredictable dynamics. It's a time when, in times of great uncertainty, at least we can be grateful to have it's tools like astrology and divination at our disposal, and having access to all sorts of great resources to which to learn these practices, to sharpen our abilities to navigate through life with a clear head and a a steady emotional center, to face these potential challenges with a kind of insight of foresight and understanding. So, if you find, if you want more of this, tell your friends. Please like and subscribe. Dan's astrology will continue to illuminate the the unknown trajectory of our planet's future. Thanks for watching. Keep on rocking the free world. Do 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 do.